Next up was Chase Strangio, representing the respondents to the case. While there aren't many differences between Ms. Strangio's arguments and those of the Solicitor General, her main claim to fame is being the first declared transgender attorney to argue before the Supreme Court. That's right, Ms. Strangio presents as a man. Now, some people may be offended by that statement, but my purpose is not to offend, and I will use a person's preferred name. While the court may be willing to do so, I will not lie to you and claim this woman is a man. Since in the English language, the proper title for a woman of unknown marital status is Ms., that is how I'll refer to her.
Mr. Strangio?
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the Court. On its face, SB 1 bans medical care only when it is inconsistent with a person's birth sex. An adolescent can receive medical treatment to live and identify as a boy if his birth sex is male but not female. And an adolescent can receive medical treatment to live and identify as a girl if her birth sex is female but not male. Tennessee claims this sex-based line drawing is justified to protect children. But SB 1 has taken away the only treatment that relieved years of suffering for each of the adolescent plaintiffs. And critically, Tennessee's arguments that SB 1 is sex neutral would apply if the state banned this care for adults too. By banning treatment only when it allows an adolescent to live, identify, or appear inconsistent with their birth sex, SB 1 warrants heightened scrutiny under decades of precedent. Because the Sixth Circuit failed to apply that standard, this court should vacate and remand. I welcome the court's questions.
Again, we see the lie of birth sex, the focus on individual drugs rather than what they are claiming to treat, and the lack of concern for whether or not these drugs are the proper treatment for a mental disorder. One concern that Justice Alito did explore with Ms. Strangio is that of suicide.
A lot of categorical statements have been made this morning in argument and in the briefs about medical questions that seem to me to be hotly disputed. And that's a bit distressing. One of them has to do with the risk of suicide. Do you maintain that the procedures and medications in question reduce the risk of suicide?
I do, Justice Alito, maintain that the medications in question reduce the risk of depression, anxiety, and suicidality, which are all indicators of potential suicide.
And do you think that's clearly established? Do you think there's reason for disagreement about that?
I do think it is clearly established in the science and in the record. I think as with all underlying questions of looking at evidence, there can be disagreement. I don't dispute that. But here, and sort of going back to questions about the Cass review, for example, the Cass review only looked at studies up until 2022.
Well, I don't regard the Cass review as necessarily as the Bible or as something that's true in every respect. But on page 195 of the Cass report, it says, there is no evidence that gender affirmative treatments reduce suicide.
What I think that is referring to is there is no evidence in the studies that this treatment reduces completed suicide. And the reason for that is completed suicide, thankfully and admittedly, is rare, and we're talking about a very small population of individuals with studies that don't necessarily have completed suicides within them. However, there are multiple studies, long-term longitudinal studies that do show that there is a reduction in suicidality, which I think is a positive outcome to this treatment.
I do have a few concerns about Ms. Strangio's position here. One is the question of suicide versus suicidality, or thoughts about suicide. Suicidality is an emotional problem, and therefore harder to quantify. Add to that the heightened levels of suicidality that come with puberty, and it's hard to differentiate whether the cause is puberty or gender dysphoria. I also wonder about the time frame for the longitudinal study she bases her position on. If someone is gender confused and expects a treatment to reduce their thoughts about suicide, there could be a placebo effect that I would expect to be short-term. Did these studies follow the patients for the years or even decades that would show a long-term solution? Compare that with the Cass report that looked at actual suicides, something that can be better measured, and I would think have a greater impact on a person's feelings which can be managed without making life-altering decisions about one's body.